The flight to LaGuardia was absolute hell. So is my wife. She's been like this ever since I told the Netflix people, not interested. I saw this refusal as the first step towards stopping the square peg from trying to fit into a round hole. Ashley considered it a cowardly abandonment of a promising career. Then, we strongly agreed to disagree over the course of a few weeks. In fact, we disagreed so much that our sex life began to feel like visiting a spouse in prison. I am a writer, and writers write. This is compulsion. We do this because we have something to say, thoughts we want to convey to anyone who will listen. Sometimes we can offer a memorable insight, one that helps people better understand their lives. But at least, we're trying to write something we can be proud of. That's why spending 6 long years creating garbage for publications like People magazine was so heartbreaking. Selling my talent allowed us to buy a nice house in Mill Valley. But I was 32 years old, and my most memorable achievement up to that point had been an episode of The Time Traveler's Wife, which was fucking humiliating. So I had to make my move now or slide down that slippery slope to a lifetime of mediocrity and self-loathing. I knew that the marital glacier would not melt until I found another job, so I planned to meet with a literary agent while I was in Manhattan. Meanwhile, we came to New York for the wedding of Ashley's sister Nadine, a prostitute. The sister was marrying some ignorant loser who considered the little woman of easy virtue to be the princess bride. I don't know if corporate tax law causes brain damage, or you have to be absolutely special to get into this field. But the guy did not understand at all that he had been deceived, perhaps already at the reception. Both sisters, that is, were complete opposites. Nadine was the youngest of the Vaughn girls. She was short, curvy, and damn hot. Ashley took after her father, a congressman. Ash was tall, model, slim, cool, and classically beautiful, with a carefully studied aura of class and sophistication. It doesn't matter how Ashley and I got together. But, needless to say, it took a little convincing to win over the Ashley family. Luckily, I knew a few Hollywood types at the time, so our engagement received a positive response from the congressman. That was enough. The man was a complete media addict. The family planned to stay at the plaza. Of course, we also stayed at the plaza. The wedding was scheduled for the 29th in the terrace room. But my wife and I arrived in town a week early because the old woman Ash calls Mama wanted both of her girls to herself tantrums were right at the center of this ancient cow's attention. The first unpleasant surprise occurred exactly 15 seconds after we entered the Fifth Avenue lobby. The congressman and the dragon stood at the front desk with the fake smiles they wore on their faces whenever they saw me. But this time they shared the stage with the arrogant, slightly equine face of William Wentworth Roman IV. Billy, as Ash called him, was an old flame from their Horace Mann days. They had dated off and on before, and I knew it was hot. But supposedly Ash and Billy weren't talking, so I assumed this idiot wouldn't come to the wedding, especially because one of the reasons Ashley and Billy broke up was because she caught him with his fiancée. However, as Scott Fitzgerald said, the rich are different from you and me. What was even more alarming was that Ashley walked past her parents, who were smiling delightedly, and threw herself into the arms of a beaming William Wentworth Roman IV. I stood with my luggage and looked at this touching scene with great disappointment. Ashley's mother said, dripping with brazen arrogance, Billy insisted on meeting Honey. As always, Wentworth looked like he stepped off the cover of GQ. He was 5 inches shorter, but slim and elegant in his stylish preppy uniform. No tie shirt, cashmere sweater, fitted trousers, and polished moccasins, all from J. Press. Varmint's carefully studied indifference exuded superiority. When Ashley disengaged from Wentworth, he stepped forward and extended his hand to me. He said in that nasal preppy accent that makes you hang on every word, "Eric, my dear man, nice to see you." Even his handshake was stylized and unnatural. I was amazed at the sheer shamelessness of it all, so I just stood there shaking his hand like an idiot. Our touching moment was interrupted by the congressman, who said, with good nature dripping from every syllable, "Come on, we have a reservation at Palm Court. We should discuss our wonderful week's vacation together." Wonderful. Wonderful. And with that, I was dragged through the lobby to this synonymous little sweet shop for tea. What followed was carefully choreographed posing designed to show others that we were better than them, or at least some of us were. The seating arrangement was Per and Madame Vaughn, Ashley, Wentworth, and me. The idiot walked around me to sit my wife between her parents and himself. I found myself between Wentworth and old Ashley. The congressman began the questioning by saying, "So, Eric, I heard you lost your job." Ashley must have felt bad for her parents. They always thought that I overestimated my capabilities. Well, let's get straight to the point. NSC pass. I said, "If you mean did I turn down the opportunity to edit sitcom scripts for Netflix, then the answer is yes. But I've written a real novel, and I need a literary agent to sell it. So I'm dating one this week." The dragon snorted and said, "How will you support your family if you don't have a job?" I knew better than to show my suffering in front of this old witch. She would love it if I got defensive, because her only goal is to denigrate me. Instead, I said politely, "I have enough money. I'm sure this will be enough for the period until the first advance." The old witch snorted disdainfully and muttered, "Lazy dog." Everyone at the table expected me to challenge her to an argument. Instead, I laughed cheerfully and said in a voice filled with good nature, "You are such a character, Mrs. V. I have always admired that." The old bitch didn't know whether she was praised or insulted, but she knew that she was humiliated. She just sat there, making gurgling noises. That's when the idiot decided to get his word in. He said condescendingly, "Seriously, Eric, don't you think it's a little childish? Every teenager wants to be Hemingway. Then they grow up and join the real world." This is from a man with a multi-million-dollar trust fund who worked as a venture capitalist using his dad's money. I was just thinking about punching the bastard when the congressman interrupted, with niceness dripping from every syllable. "If Eric wants to waste his life, then it's none of your business." Now, I didn't know whether they supported me or insulted me, but just at that moment cucumber sandwiches, scones with heavy cream, and Fortnum and Mason appeared. So we all indulged in a super pretentious afternoon tea. As soon as we got back to the room, I attacked Ashley. She was hanging out a bunch of clothes that she had brought with her, whistling a cheerful tune. I said, "What the hell, Ash?" She turned, looked at me coldly, and said, "Manners, dear." I said, "You told me you and that asshole were done for good. And when he comes out of nowhere, you're practically having sex with him in the lobby." My wife said, her eyes sparkling, "Billy and I agreed that jealousy is so aloho, honey. So we decided to be friends." I said, still seething, "When did this little truce take place? I don't remember you ever talking about this." Ash said matter-of-factly, "Oh, Billy messaged me on Facebook a couple months ago when my parents invited him to their wedding. He wanted to defuse the situation. It really doesn't matter. Now that Daff will soon be a married woman, and of course, I'm married to you." I saw the dragon's subtle hand in this, so I said, "Of course." Ashley didn't catch my sarcasm. Instead, she cheerfully said, "To show there are no bad feelings, Billy took us on a tour of the Met. They have a new Monet exhibition, and Billy is an expert on his work." The last thing I wanted was to be dragged around the Met with that pretentious jerk. But I wasn't going to leave my wife alone with him, especially after the show they both put on downstairs. So I said, "That sounds like fun." Our lack of sex must have permanently turned off Ashley's ironic sensors, because she happily dragged me down to join Billy. The timing indicated that everything had been planned in advance. We took a taxi for a short ride down Fifth Avenue. Ashley was the smallest, so she sat down in the middle. I was pressed against the right rear door, trying to give her some space. She deviated from me, as I assumed, for the same reason, but it seemed like she was actually leaning towards the jerk. I've always loved the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The building is elegant, the atmosphere is invigorating, and spending a day surrounded by great arts and culture was intellectually enriching. That is, unless you're following in the footsteps of the smug idiot who has to stop and scream like a donkey at every Monet painting on display. Wentworth would stop, tilt his head to the side, and solemnly proclaim that Monet's layering of paint made the canvas look weathered, and his deconstruction of sunlight using adjacent strokes of color was shadowy. Since Monet more or less invented Impressionism, weathered and shadowy was the whole point of the exercise, and the docent who had been hired to accompany us kept giving me glances as if to say, "Who the hell is this guy?" After the asshole's 10th pointless comment, the assistant professor finally called him out. She said, "Nothing you say is true, monsieur. In fact, it doesn't even make sense." Wentworth stopped, looked at her with contempt, and said in an icy tone, "Who are you to question me?" Okay? The assistant professor had a PhD in art history. This could be a convincing argument. And she was a Metropolitan Museum of Art certified expert on the life and work of Monet. And yet, instead of being embarrassed by the brazen arrogance of the idiot, Ashley looked at him with adoration as if to say, "What a man." The assistant professor turned around and quickly walked away. I chased after her as the idiot continued to move forward with Ashley. I caught up with the docent as she entered the next gallery. I said, "Sorry, that's just the way he is." The assistant professor said over her shoulder, "Well then, he's a smug fool," and continued walking. I couldn't say I disagreed with her. When I returned to the Monet exhibit, Ashley and Billy were nowhere to be seen. I looked for them for a while and then took a taxi back to the plaza. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is a big place, and Ashley is a big girl. If she wanted to spend the day letting Wentworth wrap himself around her, then that was her choice. Neither Ashley nor the idiot had returned for dinner, and Ashley's parents were nowhere to be seen. So I walked through Grand Army Plaza to Harry Cipriani. This is an imitation of Harry's American Bar, which is located in Venice. This establishment was supposedly one of Hemingway's favorite places, and I felt the need to connect with the lost generation, a time when people actually read books and literature was truly literature. Okay, the food is great too, although it costs a fortune. I sipped a glass of Chianti Casa Marengo and sat at a lonely table for two, watching the bright hot day turn into evening. I was struggling with a thought that had long been hovering at the edge of my consciousness: my marriage was over. In hindsight, Ashley's actions were a red flag that anyone paying even the slightest attention would have noticed. I missed it because I was too caught up in my career problems. I get a little neurotic when I feel like I'm going with the flow. And yes, I know I need to overcome this as it creates blind spots. However, the colossal disrespect Ashley showed me brought the issue to the forefront. It became clear to me that Ashley and the idiot were the perfect match. Seriously, Ashley was just as shallow, immoral, and self-righteous as Wentworth. Ashley is beautiful, like a Lamborghini, graceful and flawless. However, I realized that Ashley has nothing under the hood except a huge ego and an innate sense of entitlement to everything. I didn't know why I didn't realize this earlier. Alas, you are always too caught up in the dance of courtship to recognize the flaws in the person you are courting. My wife and I had a lot in common, at least in terms of social interests and personality traits. But by sixth year, I realized that Ashley was a very bad choice, mainly because she didn't respect or appreciate who I was. Therefore, it was clear that the only reasonable solution was to break up with her. Was my pride hurt? Certainly. Was I angry? Of course. But it wasn't for the reason you might think. I was angry at myself for taking so long to figure out who or what I was married to. This mistake was on me. But Ashley's impending betrayal was upon her. So let the games begin. The jerk was clearly making a big move on my wife, and she didn't really push him away. In fact, it seemed like she was trying to take things to the next level after her regrettable choice. Thus, it was predictable that Ash would cheat with Wentworth. And if that happens, then we're definitely done. Because betrayal erases all slates. Seriously, a guy who tries to save a marriage tainted by infidelity is either hopelessly naive or completely lacking in self-respect. Why am I saying something so extreme? Well, everyone knows the rules. I mean, it's you say them out loud when you tie the knot. Therefore, if one party deliberately chooses to ignore its public obligations, then, by definition, there is a fatal flaw that cannot simply be swept under the rug. Fixing the problem can range from dueling at dawn to co-parenting. There could even be reconciliation if both parties find a way that preserves everyone's personal integrity, I mean. That's what marriage counselors are for, right? But you can never force another person to play by the rules. This is a decision they, and only they, must make. And it was clear that Ashley made a very intentional choice, at least when it came to her fidelity. Therefore, in my mind, our marriage was over. And to be honest, I had no desire to save him. I mean, Ashley was who she was. With such parents and such an upbringing, how could she not be? At least she didn't start having sex with everyone like her sister. Then a terrible thought struck me. Maybe Ashley was just a lot smarter. Nadine was pretty stupid. Knowing that my wife may have been unfaithful should have destroyed me. But deep down, I felt only relief, not anger, not jealousy, because it freed me from any sense of obligation to our marriage. Elie Wiesel's line that the opposite of love is indifference turned out to be true here. I'm not that emotionally shallow, really, but in my mind, being angry at Ashley for her adultery would be giving the bitch too much power over me. Indifference seemed a more appropriate response. Seriously, I just didn't give myself a second thought about what this woman was doing now. In fact, on further reflection, my lack of anguish over Ashley's infidelity with her ex-lover told me everything I needed to know about next steps. Fool me once. This is a circumstance. Fool me twice. This is a hostile act. The prenuptial agreement the congressman insisted on to protect his little girl from the predatory me made the breakup easy. So maybe Ashley forcing me into action by cheating with a jerk was a good thing. I really didn't know. But I knew I wasn't going to stay in an abusive marriage longer than it took to file. I paid a huge bill with my Amex Black card. Don't be surprised. I told you that the literary business was profitable. Then I walked out of Harry's air-conditioned cool onto the hot sidewalk of Manhattan. I took a deep breath and stood there, hands in my pockets, looking around, trying to decide what to do next. Grand Army Plaza, with a colorful statue of Uncle Billy Sherman, was in the foreground. Central Park was behind her. It was the height of summer, and the trees looked like bright green icing on a huge sheet cake. Dusk was falling over the busy city, and the peace and tranquility of the park were too attractive to resist. So I walked through the plaza, past the Lombard lamp, and onto the path leading to the pond. It was almost dark when I got there. I plopped down on the bench and stared at the water. I am a person who lives in my head. I suspect all writers are like this. We are like this because we like to observe rather than participate. So, for years I observed, analyzed, and tried to fit the vagaries of life into a rational framework, all without much involvement in the real world. Now, the crap that fate had dumped on my head was returning to normal, if I may distort the metaphor. It was like, to quote Yeats, the center cannot hold. My whole world seemed to be falling apart, and it was as if the things I valued most, my dear beliefs, were incompatible with the times in which I lived. Or, in more prosaic terms, my soul or inner self, or whatever you call that voice in your head, did not belong to this world. The park dates back to the Civil War, so it could easily be 1884 or 1924, as well as 2024. I was sitting under a lamp in the dark. The traffic noise on Fifth was muffled to a dull roar by the trees, and I felt disconnected from all the worries of life. I tilted my head back for a moment and stared at the lights of passing planes as they tracked their path across the murky night sky, and it felt like the world had changed. I jumped up and looked at my Rolex. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening. I must have dozed off on the bench. I knew Ashley wouldn't worry, because she was undoubtedly busy with other things. But I had to go back to the hotel. So I hurried out of the park and encountered a scene that was so shocking that my knees went weak. I staggered toward the Tecumseh statue and plopped down on the grass. I'm sure everyone who saw me thought I was drunk. But alcohol was the least of my problems, especially because it wasn't on sale then. The plaza was still there, of course, and the buildings of Manhattan surrounded me as usual. But there were none of the modern skyscrapers that fill downtown and lower Manhattan. I could smell coal smoke as the streetcar rumbled past me on 59th Street. The buildings were lit, but with old Edison bulbs, so the lighting was more yellow and less bright. People were still walking along Fifth, but the men were much more formal, dressed up in vests and fedoras, and the women wore dresses and small hats rather than jeans and blouses. That's when it dawned on me. As impossible as it was, I was no longer in Kansas. I searched my memory for a plausible explanation and found nothing. There was not a single rational reason other than a mental disorder. I had to be hallucinating. But this is not because of my wife's infidelity. I mean, I had already made a decision about this, which I fully understood and accepted. So I very much doubted that I would be sent to an insane asylum because of Ashley. Therefore, the only other option, at least the only rational one, was that I was asleep. I mean, the dream feels real while you're experiencing it, right? No matter how strange the context, and nothing that I saw around me, sights, sounds, even smells, were familiar to my modern senses. Think about it, how you would react if you thought you were in a dream. I expected to wake up sooner or later, and so I was temporarily okay with that assumption. Moreover, I will not give in under pressure. This was a value my father taught me. He used to say, "If you can hold your head when everyone around you is losing theirs, then you are a man, my son." He took it from Kipling's poem, which is certainly 19th century irony, but it has guided my response to stress my entire life. Consequently, I was less concerned about whether I was awake in the dream than I was, wondering what would happen next. That's when the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost, with its long hood, beige body, chrome wire wheels, and camel top, pulled up smoothly in front of me. He stopped, and I heard the voices of several people inside. The guy stuck his head out the window and said, "Come on, old man. We have a party to go to." It was a dream. Right, so this should be the next scene. I stood up, brushed myself off, and walked over to the car. The passenger opened the door, and I plopped down in the back seat, which in the Silver Ghost feels like a big leather couch. In the back of the car, besides me, there were 4 more people. They were spread out in the back seat and jump seats, all of them clearly drunk. If it was the period I thought it was, then their drinking would mean that they were breaking the law, because alcohol was banned in 1920 by the Volstead Act, and this was clearly sometime in the 20s. How did I know this? Well, there was no depression, and no one was in shape, so it wasn't the 30s and 40s. Therefore, it had to be the roaring 20s, that unfortunate decade when the government thought it could legislate morality. The Rolls-Royce rolled smoothly down 5th to 44th, turned right, and pulled up to the front of the hotel. The people inside were singing "Makin' Whoopee." It was clear from the context that they understood the meaning of the text. I thought, I wouldn't add double meanings to a dream, would I? So there was a little bit of reality to it. The guy who answered the door said his name was Cantor, and this was his song. I had a vague memory of a singer named Cantor. Of course, he died a long time ago. So my dream also took on a sense of absurdity. He populated himself with real historical figures. The other 3 passengers were women, thin, flat, and demonstrating a lot of legs. They all had dark hair cut into the bob style popular in the 20s. They were as drunk and merry as Mr. Cantor. I said, puzzled, "Why did you pick me up? You in the office, there were big bulging eyes." They looked at me with amusement as he said, "You were drunk, old man, so you should have been looking for a party." The rolls stopped, and without further ado, all 4 of my fellow passengers jumped out in drunken joy. I slowly got out, stepped off the step, and stood on the sidewalk. The rolls drove away silently. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out where I was. There was noise coming from the large hall to the right of the reception desk. This was supposed to be the epicenter of the fun. The sounds of clarinet, trumpet, piano, banjo, and drums, and the screams of joyful guests were my first clues. I entered a large hall lined with walnut and saw something that I had hitherto only seen in flashing black and white. It was a real jazz party with the shakes and flappers. They all danced wildly to the frenetic sound of 5'2" Eyes of Blue. Showers were not common at that time, so people took a bath maybe once a week. This added another contrast to my time. The room smelled of perfume and unwashed people, not to mention tobacco. A drunk man in a tuxedo, I kid you not. Formal dress, put his arm around my shoulders and muttered, "Drink to me, buddy." He handed me a glass of champagne and walked back into the seething mass. I stood there, puzzled. Then I noticed an alcove leading off the main hall. A small group of people stood there looking like European explorers, studying an as yet undiscovered tribe of natives. They seemed sober and relatively intelligent, so I headed towards them. I thought they might give me a hint. There were 4 people there, 3 men and a petite woman. One of the men looked vaguely familiar. The other 2 were clearly literary types, tweed suits, round glasses, and all. But the woman caught my attention, because there was a photograph of her on the wall in my writing room. This was Dorothy Parker, a true American character. Dorothy, or Dot as her friends called her, was one of the most famous literary figures of the 20th century. But her real fame lay in her wit. She died in 1967. That's why I never saw her alive. Alive, she was a very attractive woman, tiny, only 5 feet, and slender. But it was the dark beauty of her face, thick brown hair, huge intelligent eyes, and regular features that attracted you. Of course, her animated mind kept you riveted. At the moment she was talking to a guy who seemed familiar to me. So I slowly approached them, as if wanting to join in the conversation. Dot stopped, turned her head, and said dryly, "What kind of anthropoid are you?" I knew I had to come up with something witty, or she would brush it off from me. Without blinking an eye, I said, "I'm a bifurcated species because I have a crack in my ass. And you?" This caused laughter as Dot wore a corset like all the other ladies. Therefore, it seemed that she only had one buttock. Dot turned to the guy I thought I recognized and said, "I like this guy, Harpo. Great googly moogly. I've seen enough Marx Brothers and Goofballs movies to know who this guy is." And I immediately realized that I was out of my league, which was ironic because my dream was where that league existed. I extended my hand and said, "Eric," and he took it and said, "Arthur." This had to be his real name, which I didn't know. Also, if you've ever seen a Marx Brothers movie, you know that Harpo is the one who doesn't speak. So it was strange to hear him speak. The other 2 guys were Art Samuels, who edited The New Yorker, and Alexander Woolcott, the worst critic in New York. These 4 were original members of the Algonquin Round Table, which was the most significant gathering of literary giants since the Inklings, and this was the Algonquin Hotel, so there was some logic to my dream. But it was getting stranger by the minute. Dot said, "So what's a cat like you doing at this party?" I assumed it was 20-year-old slang for a guy since I clearly wasn't a cat. I could start a long story about betrayal in the 21st century, but that would put me in a straitjacket. Instead, I said, "I've written a novel and I'm here to find a publisher." It was simple enough because it was factually true. Dot looked at me sharply and said, "Do you have it with you?" I said, "He's in my room at the plaza," which was also true, except it was 100 years in the future. Dot said, "I'd love to have a look at it. If he's good enough, I know a few people." She then dug into her purse and pulled out a yellow pencil, sharpened almost to an eraser, along with what looked like a laundry receipt. She told Harpo, "Turn around," and wrote the address using his back. She handed it to me and said casually, "Call me or come in." At this point, I had to look at the new arrival. He turned out to be a guy who was clearly too pretentious, even for this time, where pompous behavior was the norm. What was even more important was that he was with a woman who was so beautiful it took my breath away. Woolcott said with contempt dripping from every syllable, "His lordship has arrived." Luckily for me, Samuels added, "And look at the candy Ziegfeld is with tonight." This was helpful because it gave me the person's name. This was Flo Ziegfeld Hugh Hefner before Hefner was even born. Ziegfeld was famous for his grand theatrical revues with incredibly sexy women in daring costumes. This created the Ziegfeld girl type. Sounds like a playmate, doesn't it? If you were a certain kind of woman in the early 20th century, Ziegfeld could make you a reputation if he opened. Of course, like Hefner, this discovery usually included a visit to Flo's luxurious bedroom. So I assumed that the woman he came with was his current mistress. Dot turned to me and said, "He's a showman for the ages 4 to 8. But now he is in fashion, and he likes to be catered to. So I need to go talk to this big one. With a helmet. Call me or come in." With these words, she ran up to the group of Ziegfeld admirers. I stood there trying to translate that sentence into modern English. It seemed that adulation was the only thing Ziegfeld loved more than beautiful women, because he completely ignored the girl he came with and enthusiastically told his assembled fans. She, in turn, came up to me. She looked lost. I'm too reserved to talk to a woman for no reason. But this one was so stunningly beautiful that I walked closer and said, "It seems like your friend has a lot of admirers." She turned to me and said sadly, "He is not my friend. Mr. Ziegfeld is my patron." Yes, yes, of course. I was struck by her naivety when she said this. I mean, she was gorgeous, with thick brown hair, a long, graceful neck, huge hazel eyes, and such regular features that it looked like Botticelli had painted them. But there was still something about her that radiated innocence. She wore the heavy makeup popular at the time, which made her look like a sensual raccoon. Her lips were bright red, as were her nails. It suited fashion. Girls of the 20s were flat-chested and slender, and modest dresses suited these features perfectly. But this woman's body in her sparkly dress was the exact opposite of what the designers were trying to achieve. She was slender, with very nice round hips and a gorgeous pair of big round breasts. So the flapper dress looked almost obscene on her, and it was clear that she was uncomfortable wearing it. I felt a sudden surge of sympathy for her, so I said, trying to ease her embarrassment, "You are very beautiful. Are you the star of one of the Ziegfeld shows?" She blushed and said modestly, "You must not be from here. Alice Wilk and Louise Brooks are its stars. I live in a boarding house on West 24th Street. She realized that this sounded off-putting, so she added enthusiastically, "I love writing, and I'm trying to get into it. I met Mr. Ziegfeld at a party last week, and he invited me to come with him today. He says this is my debut." Then she added with genuine joy, "I should get a good story out of this." "Of course, my dear." However, she said this with complete sincerity. Maybe she really is that naive. The old lecher was clearly preparing this beauty for something, and I doubted it had anything to do with writing. But it would probably make a great plot for the kind of novels that were popular back then. However, her enthusiasm for writing surprised me. I said, "Do you like writing?" She beamed with enthusiasm. "I was born to write. I have a million ideas in my head," and she pointed to her beautiful head. She added, "I've written some stories, and Mr. Ziegfeld says he knows people at the New Yorker who will publish them. I just met the editor of this new magazine." In fact, Samuels and Dot were standing in the middle of the room, bantering with Ziegfeld while we were talking to her. Then the beautiful woman next to me seemed to come to her senses and said embarrassedly, "Where are my manners? My name is Julia Richmond," and held out her graceful hand for me to shake. I took her hand and said, "Frank Sullivan, at your service." I could use my real name, but every writer takes a pseudonym to separate his real life from his fantasy life. And in the end, I was in a dream. Sullivan was a minor writer from the 20s, so I thought that no one would recognize this name in the place where the Algonquin Round Table reigned. Julia said cheerfully, "Nice to meet you, Frank." It was the sort of country greeting you might hear if you met someone in a country store. I asked, "Where are you from?" It was obvious that he was not from Manhattan Island. She said proudly, "Toledo, Ohio." Holy damn, she really just got off the farm. She added flirtatiously, "Where are you from, Frank?" I said, "Mill Valley, California." She said, "Oh, it's a long way from here. Why are you in New York?" I said, "I have a novel that I'm trying to sell. Dorothy Parker." I nodded towards Dot, "Is going to take a look at it and maybe help me sell it to a publisher." Julia asked, "Who is Dorothy Parker?" I said, surprised, "How long have you been in New York?" Julia stood looking like a Labrador who had just returned with a duck in his mouth and said, "Almost 2 months. I graduated from white school and worked for a couple of years. But I wanted to write, and Manhattan was the only place I could go to get discovered. My parents gave me enough money to live in New York for a year, and if I can't do it in that time, I should move back home. This made the woman 21 or 22 years old. I was impressed by her courage. She had a dream. She wanted to make it a reality and was brave enough to go to the right place. Of course, dropping a beauty like Julia off a bus into the wilds of Manhattan was akin to throwing a juicy lamb into a pack of wolves. I asked, nodding toward Ziegfeld, "So he's your steady boyfriend?" Julia blushed bright pink, which was easy to see given her skimpy dress, and said, "This is my first night with him, and he was a little pushy. I'm not that kind of girl. I mean, I have plenty of experience with guys, but it was pretty obvious. How could such a beauty not have experience with men?" She continued, "But I'm not easy like my roommates." I was going to say, "How easy," a little humor, but I was sure that would end the conversation, and I didn't want that. So instead I said, "Would you like to meet up sometime and talk about writing?" Hey, it was my dream, and she was my dream girl. This will all end when I wake up, so why not? Her beautiful face lit up with pure joy, and she said, "I would love to. Do you have a piece of paper on which I can write down the boarding house number?" I said, "Just say it," and pulled out my cell phone. She looked puzzled and said, "What is this?" I said, "This is a thing I bought at Popular Mechanics. I can write things down on it." Popular Mechanics had been around for 20 years in 1925, and it did have some weird gadgets. Julia looked skeptical, but said, "Pennsylvania 6 to 5,000. I wrote this down and was putting the phone back in my pocket when Ziegfeld walked up majestically. The man was significantly shorter than me. Julia was probably 5'3", and Ziegfeld was no more than 5'5". Of course, most of the men in the room were shorter than me, and I was not a giant. But this was the 20s when the tall guy was about 6 feet. Ziegfeld was impeccably dressed, with a Tom Selleck mustache and an air of complete arrogance. Ignoring me, he put his arm around Julia's waist, pulled her towards him, and led her back to the center of the room like a captured maiden. I heard his loud voice, "And this is Miss Julia Richmond, my new protege." Everyone in the room knew what that meant, and Ziegfeld made it crystal clear if they didn't. Julia looked puzzled, but she stood there to be appreciated, like a broodmare at a horse show. I immediately hated this man. He treated my dream girl like a piece of meat. A sudden wave of despair washed over me. I said to myself, "This is crazy. I burn with jealousy in my own sleep." Disgusted with myself, I turned and walked out of the room, through the lobby and onto 44th Street. The Rolls stood there with the door open. I sat down and told the driver, "To the plaza," and the Rolls rolled off smoothly. I sat and thought, "You pathetic puppy. Your wife is cheating on you and you don't care. But the woman you met in your dream will have sex today, and it makes you crazy with jealousy." Rolls dropped me off at 59th Street, which was the main entrance to the plaza in those days. I left the plush interior and walked up the steps to the lobby. Our room was on the 7th floor. I had a key card in my pocket. If this was the 21st century, if it was 1925, well then, it would be a completely different story. I would have been homeless in New York since I only had modern money. The elevator was not one of today's self-service elevators. There was a cameraman in it. He said, "Which floor, sir?" I said, "7th." And he started to close the door. The elevator went up, and he opened it. I went out into the hallway, expecting to go down the stairs since I didn't have a key. I had a moment of dizziness when the elevator doors closed, and I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. The dizziness passed, and when I opened my eyes, I was back in the 21st century. I put the card on the reader, the green light turned on, and I entered a dark, empty room. There was no sign of Ashley. I didn't expect that they would. I got ready for bed and lay down on the pillow. The clock by the bed showed 1.5 hours. Ashley woke me up when she came into the room about an hour later. She undressed in the bathroom and slid under the covers. She was clearly trying not to wake me, which was ironic. because it wouldn't have mattered if she had come accompanied by the Michigan marching band playing Hail to the Victors. It was all over between us. I opened my eyes in a light-filled room at a luxury hotel in Midtown Manhattan. If it was a dream, then why was I so depressed at the thought of what Julia might have done last night or 99 years ago, depending on how crazy I was? Ashley slept next to me, but she woke up when I finished in the bathroom. I said, trying not to sound irritated, "What time did you get back last night?" Ashley looked me straight in the eyes and lied, "At 1:30. You were asleep." "Okay, the game has begun." I said, "I lost you at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Where were you until such a late hour? I could have put her in a trap right away." She said with a completely innocent face, "Oh, Billy and I ran into my parents when we got back, and we decided to go on a dinner cruise around Manhattan. There was a band and a boat dance, so we came back late." This was another lie. Dinner cruises don't end at 3 in the morning, since the passengers will all be robbed while returning to their hotels. Of course, I was sure that Ashley would do everything possible to prevent me from testing this little story with her parents. But then again, they've probably already agreed on their stories. My wife said, trying to sound friendly, "What have you been doing all night?" I said. "I had dinner at Cipriani and then sat by the pond. Then I came back here and went to bed." It was all true except for a short excursion into the jazz age. Ashley looked like she expected me to do something so boring and ordinary. She clearly didn't respect me at all. I was interested to hear another great story, so I said, "What are your plans for today?" Ashley blushed and said, "Billy wants to show me his place in Sagaponack." It was outside of Bridgehampton, a few hours away on Long Island. It takes a lot of money to live there. Ashley quickly added, "I knew you had a meeting with your agent today, so I told him I was going with him alone." Well, obviously you think I'm a fool. I have a twisted sense of humor, so I just had to play cat and mouse with her. Seriously, this is a curse among ordinary people. I said, with a concerned look on my face, "I don't like the idea of you spending so much time alone with Wentworth. We'll end it if you sleep with him, you know." I could immediately outline the rules for the upcoming divorce, and people who think I should have just confronted Ashley with my suspicions don't understand the game. I didn't have proof yet. Ashley showed contempt for a moment, saying coldly, "You know I don't like it when you use that word. Deviation, deviation, deviation." Then she added with a completely straight face, "Billy and I are just old friends." She finished with a reassuring, "You know I would never do anything to jeopardize my marriage to you." Yes, she definitely thinks I'm stupid. It wasn't like I needed pictures to divorce the bitch. California is a no-fault state, and it will be served as soon as we get back. The prenuptial agreement made this easy. It may seem paranoid to go through with the divorce so abruptly, given that I had no actual evidence. But honestly, at that moment it was more a matter of respect than loyalty. The absence of the former was obvious, even if the latter remained a little unclear. There is no point in continuing this farce any longer. I said, "Well, I'm having breakfast with my agent, but I have to see you here for dinner." Ashley said annoyedly, "You can't tell me what to do." I said warningly as I left the room, "Be here." Was that a look of uncertainty on her face? The meeting with the Igler representative was productive. You can submit your manuscript anonymously to most agencies, but to be accepted, you need to imagine the face behind the text. My merits and experience helped me meet with a potential agent, and we had a good conversation. Then I hurried to an old numismatic and antique store on East 57th Street. If I was going to go back to the 20s, I needed the money of that time. I bought antique banknotes and coins worth $1,000 for 10 of their denominations. This should last for a time when a good breakfast costs less than $1. I returned to the plaza and printed out the manuscript. I wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with twine. Then I put it in a vintage leather briefcase that I bought at a thrift store in Harlem, where I also bought a used fedora and vest. Then, dressed according to the era, I returned to my bench. It was the height of summer in Manhattan with all the city noise and diesel fumes. but the park provided a relatively quiet refuge. It was about 8 in the evening when I last dreamed a phenomenon that was beginning to seem like a real transition. The sun was just starting to set, so I expected to wait a while. But as soon as I sat back and closed my eyes, I felt that familiar feeling of dizziness. I opened my eyes and saw a young couple passing by. I must have looked like I was sleeping because the woman smiled at me. Their clothes set the time for me, so I slowly rose from the bench, stretched, and headed down the path back to the jazz age. Rolls waited where carriages pick up passengers in the 21st century. The passenger compartment door was open. I checked the address Dorothy Parker had given me, and to my surprise, it turned out that she actually lived in Algonquin. So I told the driver to take me to 59 West 44th. The entrance to Algonquin, or Gonk, as all the literary types called it, was pretty much what it looks like today, a hinged entrance and two heavy wooden doors. The lobby was oak, and the pergola restaurant was to the left. I met Billy as soon as I walked in from the street. Billy was a lifelong resident of Algonquin, and there wasn't a more violent, street-fighting scoundrel in the entire city. He wandered into the lobby one stormy night in 1919 and decided to stay. And from that moment until his death 15 years later, he greeted guests. Did I mention Billy was a cat? His perfect tabby marks were marred by a torn ear and slightly curled tail, which he received in a legendary fight with one of the guests' French poodles. The epic battle was reportedly declared a draw, and both fighters were taken to the vet by their owners. I stroked Billy as he curled around my legs as Dot emerged from Oak Hall. This place took up most of the back of the restaurant. She had been dining there for the past 8 hours with other members of the Malevolent Circle. That was the name of the Algonquin Round Table, and she had clearly had a little too much to drink. Dorothy Parker was never shy about admitting that she drank too much. I took the manuscript out of my briefcase and handed it to her. Like most alcoholics, Dot was able to function just fine no matter how much she drank. She said sarcastically, "Hey, Skippy, you didn't lie to me, right?" I said, laughing. "No, I just had to bring it," meaning the manuscript. Of course, the trip included a visit to the future, and the original manuscript was on a flash drive, which I printed out at the Plaza Business Center because no one uses paper these days. But that would be too much information. The point is that I was about to receive criticism from one of the finest literary minds of the 20th century, or any century. Dot was hanging out with Frank Adams, who was well known in those days, and writer-actor Bob Benchley. It looked like they were heading to another party, so I said, "Can I join?" in hopes of seeing Julia again. Dot muttered, "Of course, more the better." Rolls was waiting for me when we left. I said, "Drive my car." They all looked at me as if they couldn't believe it was my car, but she seemed to accept me as part of my dream. I said, "Where?" and Benchley said, "New Amsterdam on 42nd. Ziegfeld is having a party after his latest review." This confirmed it. I was officially declared crazy. I mean, how can you feel so much joy at the prospect of meeting a girl in your dreams? We all climbed into the back seat, and the Rolls rolled toward 42nd Street in the theater district. The party was backstage at the Ziegfeld Theater, and all the major stars were there. Billy Burke, Louise Brooks, W.C. Fields, and a guy who was clearly a cowboy. I asked Benchley who he was, and he looked at me as if I had just fallen from the garden. "Don't you recognize Will Rogers?" I said, backing away. "I only heard it on the radio." Adams said, "Who's the new mistress?" Of course it was Julia. She stood obediently next to Ziegfeld. He ignored her completely, enthusiastically talking to his assembled group of fans. She was looking down. She seemed ashamed. But she looked up when we made eye contact and covered her face with her hands, looking upset. Have you ever experienced that moment when the fog of everyday life lifts and you see what exactly is true? Well, it happened to me right there, in that place. My wife Ashley was a beautiful woman and met all the basic requirements for a wife, except for the current circumstances. But my attraction to Ashley was more like an easy friendship compared to the deep feelings I felt for Miss Julia Richmond. However, this was a completely different situation. Completely. I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I couldn't just walk away from Julia Richmond any more than I could cut off my left leg. She seemed to feel something too, because she touched Ziegfeld's hand and my jealousy sensor went off scale. She said something to him. Then she began to slowly approach me. I nodded toward the dark room off to the side, where they seemed to store theater scenery. She nodded slightly, and we both disappeared inside. She stood there for a moment, looking at me, a look of confusion on her pretty face. I, for one, wasn't the least bit embarrassed. I knew what I wanted. Therefore, I had to set everything straight. It was too important, and the situation was so fragile. Therefore, there was no other choice. I could be a married man 100 years in the future. But I was Frank Sullivan at the time, and I didn't care how absurd the situation was. I've finally found the one, and something as small as the continuum of time and space won't stop me. I said with feeling, I couldn't stop thinking about you. She tilted her head to the side and asked, thinking about me, what does that mean? I laughed and said, I have no idea what that means. But from the moment we met, I felt a special connection with you. You're beautiful and all, but it goes much deeper. I know you feel it too. She nodded quietly. A little voice in my head screamed, You've lost your damn mind. I was making a sincere confession to a woman who may have died before I was born. I mean, seriously. You might consider moving to another country for the love of your life, but to another century. Not to mention that I had no guarantee that I would be able to stay there. It was 1925, an era of boundless optimism. America was the new kid on the block. We ended these internal European wars once and for all, and everyone could get rich on Wall Street. It was also one of the most important times for American literature. Fitzgerald had just published The Great Gatsby, and Hemingway was finishing The Sun Also Rises. William Faulkner had recently published his first novel and was working on The Sound and the Fury, so it was the perfect time to be a writer. However, I was not a native inhabitant of this era, and there would be no records of me, not that it would matter when all the records were kept in hard-to-reach file cabinets. But I was from a different time. My life could be unsatisfactory there, and of course, there was the small problem of my unfaithful wife. But the 21st century was my home. Julia looked worried. I would too if the person I was talking to suddenly went silent. I needed to pull myself together. So I said, I was hoping to get to know you better. You and I have a lot in common in terms of values and ideas, and I would like to see if we can build a relationship. Julia looked sad, saying, I feel the same way, but you are 1 day late. For 1 day, what does this mean? Julia continued with regret in her voice. I became Mr. Ziegfeld's woman last night, and that cannot be changed. A stab of jealousy struck me. It was like an electric shock. She added, sheepishly, I don't know what came over me, then grinned and said, Well, I know what came over me, but I don't know why I did it. Still, I did it, and now I have to follow it, or I'll be one of those girls. Seriously, is it true? I just stood there, looking at this beautiful woman speechless. Finally, I muttered, wait, you're saying you slept with Ziegfeld, and now you can't consider other offers? It was hard to believe that a woman could be so old-fashioned in the 21st century. But of course, those were old-fashioned times. I understand, I shouldn't have liked it. But I did. Women's attitudes and behavior were only 20 years away from the stifling morality of the Victorian era. And this meticulous old shrew still held tightly in an iron grip how most women defined virtue. So this may have been the Roaring Twenties, a watershed moment when morals and manners underwent dramatic changes. Young women bobbed their hair and wore bold dresses. They danced to impressive music. But these were modern women, not the girl from Toledo, Ohio. Last night Julia let Ziegfeld be her man, so now she must be faithful to him, otherwise she will consider herself a woman of easy virtue. I said, disappointed, well, if Ziegfeld doesn't work out, I want a chance to build a relationship with you. Julia gave me an inscrutable look, part longing and part deepest regret, and said dejectedly, please don't forget me. Then she turned around looking as if she was ready to cry and returned to her place next to Ziegfeld. Julia looked worried. I would be too if the person I was talking to suddenly went silent. I needed to pull myself together. So I said, I was hoping to get to know you better. You and I have a lot in common in terms of values and ideas, and I would like to see if we can build a relationship. The music started playing and the party guests became noisy, but my main feeling was a feeling of hopelessness and depression, which was ironic considering I was about to return to the 21st century where my wife had cheated on me and I had absolutely no feelings about it other than liberation. I wanted to say goodbye to Dottie before I left. She was arguing in the corner with a high society lady about the 19th Amendment. There were still parts of America that thought women were too flighty and emotional to make decisions about the direction of the country. Dottie's opponent was clearly one of those. I know it sounds ridiculous now, but those were different times. When I approached, Dottie clasped her hands and walked away, muttering, "You can manage the gardening, but you can't make her think." She saw me, stopped, and said angrily, "What, Skippy?" I said softly, "I'm leaving, but wanted to set up a time to talk to you after you've read my manuscript." She said sarcastically, "Give me a day, and I'll see you at the round table." I didn't know if this was even possible. Since the Algonquin Round Table met for lunch, I could only cross at night local time. But I smiled at her gratefully and said, "See you around and enjoy." I sat down and told the driver Plaza and sat down and thought about how bad my current situation was. The transition happened the moment I left the rolls, perhaps because my situation in the 20s was so dire. I entered from the south lobby of Central Park, which was the main entrance in the 20s, and Ash's old man was sitting on the side of Grand Army Plaza, so we almost missed each other. But he noticed me as I approached the elevators and yelled, "Eric, wait." When the great man approached, I thought, holy shit, he didn't look friendly. He said in his elegant political voice, "I want to talk to you about something. Let's have a drink in my room." I said irritably, "Can't this wait until tomorrow? I'm tired." He said, "No, we need to settle this now." I pointed to one of the tables in the lobby and said, "Okay, let's just sit here and you can say what you want." The congressman was upset by this arrangement, but he saw that my joining him in his room was useless. I'm really not as stupid as everyone thought. So we sat down in a couple of semi-uncomfortable chairs located near the lobby window. The congressman got straight to the point. He said, "What are you doing, coming at this hour, smelling like cigarettes?" I understood what he meant. He thought I was having sex. If I had told him that I was at Flo Ziegfeld's party with Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley, he would have had no doubt that I had been assigned. So I said, "Nothing that concerns you." He blushed as he said, "It's my business if you're going to cause a scandal that will affect my re-election." His concern for his daughter was touching. "No," I said, "talk to Ashley. She's the one sleeping with her old boyfriend." I could see from the way the congressman's eyes shifted that he was aware of the problem. But he was indignant. "She's just renewing acquaintances with an old friend. They don't do anything else." I said sarcastically, "All night, at his house." The congressman said, "She's been waiting here for you all evening." I said in disbelief, "Really? Seriously? How do you know this?" The congressman replied, "Because she called me half an hour ago and asked where you were. You didn't answer the phone." Cellular communications didn't work very well in the 1920s. I asked, "Did you really see her?" He said, "No, but I'm guessing she's in your room." I said, laughing at him, "Let's go find out." No wonder. I opened the door to the room, and it was empty. As I expected, I said mockingly, "Looks like your little girl is spending the night with her old friend." The congressman gave me a look that showed that he realized I was in a vice and said, "I'll handle it." He added warningly, "Don't even think about divorcing her." Then he turned on his heel and hurried down the corridor to the elevators. I fell asleep, tormented by the fact that Ziegfeld had spent the night with Julia. The next morning, Ash appeared. Daddy must have interrupted her little tryst with Horseface. It wasn't because the congressman didn't approve of his daughter's attempt to make the deal. This happened because the idea of divorce, especially one involving infidelity, did not receive the attention it deserved in the media. I was finishing getting dressed when Ash sneaked into the room. She just stood there. I said scornfully, "Did you have fun last night?" Ash used a fake countermeasure like the flares the F-16 uses to distract heat-seeking missiles and said pleadingly, "Oh, Eric, I'm so sorry." I said with a straight face, "Sorry about what? I don't quite understand what you're apologizing about." Ashley rushed to me to hug and comfort her, which would lead to sex, which would then lead to her forgiveness. It was an old, outdated tactic, and I didn't believe it this time. I held her at arm's length and said, "Actions have consequences, my dear. You have made your choice. Now I have to make my own." Ash looked scared. Dad must have been very insistent. She said, angry because her trick didn't work, "Oh, grow up. It was just one night." She then added seductively, "There was no love. It was just sex in the good times. Now we can go back to our wonderful life together in California as if nothing happened." I had to laugh about it. I said, "Do you really think I will believe this fairy tale? Because if you do, then you must think I'm a complete moron." I added briskly, "Well, it doesn't matter anyway. I'm going on a trip. We can talk about this when I get back. That is, if I come back." With these words, I turned around and walked out the door. I heard a plaintive, "But Eric," when the door to the room slammed behind me. I mean, the concept of Ash and honest repentance was left out. So, Dad must have been cruel to his beloved at least after he caught up with her. I knew I would need money to survive long term. So, I took a taxi and made the short trip to the gold dealer on West 47th Street. In 1925, gold was still legal tender. Therefore, I would have no problem finding a suitable currency. A few hours later, I had $100,000 worth of 1-ounce gold bars in my leather bag. This represented half of Ash and my net worth. She received the other half in the prenuptial agreement. I also took some modern antibiotics with me. Penicillin was a decade in the future. I thought this might come in handy in an era where common diseases can kill you. Seriously, immunities we take for granted, such as the Salk vaccine, didn't exist in the 1920s. Just ask Roosevelt, who had just contracted the early symptoms of polio that left him wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life. Now all I could do was wait, so I wandered around the various shops on 5th Street, waiting for the sun to set. At the same time, I had the feeling that I was being watched. How delicious. Dad was watching me. He was no doubt hoping to reveal something that he could use as counter-programming to any accusations of impropriety on the part of his daughter. If he did, he's in for a big surprise. Finally, it got dark enough. I walked towards my park bench, ignoring the rustling in the bushes behind me. I plopped down on the bench, placing the bag of gold bars on my lap and leaning my head back. Magic happened, and it was an amazingly beautiful Manhattan night outside. The full moon hung over the trees by the pond. Crickets were chirping, insects were buzzing, and there was no sign of the guy with the Nikon behind me. I got up and headed to my trusty Rolls and drove down to Algonquin. I had enough cash to rent a room for a month. The bill was only $80. If you double this amount and add 2 or 3 zeros, you can get an idea of modern prices. I took the brass key to the room and went up to the 5th floor. The room seemed a little strange compared to modern hotels, but it was luxurious except for the lack of air conditioning. However, there was a floor fan, and with the windows open, it was nice to fall asleep to the sounds of the 1925 city. I woke up from the same sounds. It was a combination of traffic noise, horses, and the occasional rumble of a tram. I had breakfast at the Pergola restaurant and went outside looking for a taxi. There were several bright yellow Model A's parked outside the hotel. Now I know where the term yellow taxi came from. I needed clothes that were period appropriate, and I knew Brooks Brothers was still in business on Madison Avenue. 3 hours later, and nearly $600 lighter, I was fully equipped for life in the roaring 20s. I lost 1,001 in exchanging my bullion for equivalent 1920s currency, but prices in the 20s made up the difference. Then, dressed for the occasion in a tailored Harris tweed suit, I rode the elevator down to meet the Wicked Circle. The Algonquin Round Table included a distinguished group of journalists, authors, essayists, and actors who met daily for lunch. They sat at a 15-seat round table in the Rose Room, which was actually the back of the restaurant in the Algonquin lobby. Key members of the Round Table included Frank Adams, Alexander Wolcott, Robert Benchley, George Kaufman, Harpo Marx, and, of course, Dottie. In addition to the main group, present at today's dinner were Harold Ross and his wife Jane Grant, who had just founded a small magazine called The New Yorker. It was pretty much everyone who was somebody in the New York literary scene. Ziegfeld wasn't there. It was disappointing because I was hoping to meet Julia. But since Ziegfeld was more of a showman than witty, he would never have received an invitation. When she saw me, Dottie said, "Have a seat, Frank, or is it Eric?" "Oops, I left my real name on the title page." I said, laughing, "That's the nickname I wanted to use in case you don't like it. Call me Frank if you like it." My heart was pounding when she said, "I liked it. Frank, the literary world needs to take itself less seriously." I could have kissed her if she hadn't been on the other side of the table, because a blessing from Dorothy Parker was the golden ticket. Ross turned to me and said, "Hey, we need an article. Can you have something ready for next month?" I didn't ask him how much they were paying because I never thought I'd get the opportunity to be published at such a career high as the New Yorker. I just said, yes. The group then proceeded to lunch, accompanied by witty remarks, puns, and jokes that eventually spread throughout the country through the radio and newspaper columns of its members. In fact, the Round Table was where most of America's slang expressions and social sentiments were shaped in the 1920s and 30s. But this was not a place for the faint of heart. Dottie summed it up best when she said, "The first thing I do in the morning is brush my teeth and sharpen my tongue." I just sat and listened. I didn't participate because there was an underlying current of intellectual intensity and pure malice that told me I couldn't handle their blows. It was like watching heavyweights fight in Madison Square Garden. Nonetheless, it was an intellectually stimulating spectacle, as some of the finest minds of the time debated concepts that would shape literary ideals to this day. But I wasn't in the 1920s to discuss ideas. I was there because, as crazy as it sounds, the woman of my dreams lived in this era. Finally, I leaned over to sports writer Haywood Brunn, who was sitting next to me, and asked, "How long has this been going on?" He laughed and said, "Endless." So I stood up and said, "I'm sorry and thank you for the invitation, but I have important business to deal with now." Dottie waved her hand as if to say I didn't need to apologize and went back to the argument. I silently said, "We'll talk later." I then turned around and went to the front desk in the lobby and asked the clerk for the phone book, which he gave me. It was surprisingly thin compared to the Manhattan phone books of later decades. But telephones in the 1920s were still a novelty owned mostly by wealthy people and businesses. Julia lived in a boarding house, but Julia Richmond was not on the list. So all I had to do was call the number she gave me. I needed a phone, so I asked the clerk for my home phone number. He pointed across the lobby to a telephone mounted on the wall with a built-in speaker and a separate cord to the receiver. I picked up the phone, there was a click, and a woman's voice said, "Number, please." "Seriously," I said hesitantly, "Pennsylvania 65000. The voice said, "1 minute, please," and there was a loud click and a very distant beep. Someone picked up after 8 rings and said, "Yes." I said, "Miss Julia Richmond, please." A distant voice said, "Wait," and seemed to drop the phone as it hit the wall several times. After an agonizingly long time, a distant voice said hesitantly, "This is Miss Julia Richmond, who's calling, please." My heart was in my throat as I said, "This is Frank Sullivan, Julia. I'd like to meet you somewhere so we can talk about writing like we've been discussing." There was a pause. Then she said with joy in her voice, "I would like to, Frank." I said, relieved, Give me your address and I'll pick you up. So I walked towards a complete stranger, whom I, being married, madly desired. This situation was fantastically incredible, and, without a doubt, a sign of my complete mental collapse. But there was so much at stake that I was as nervous as the night I took my first date to prom. My trusty Rolls was clearly part of my delusion because it followed me around like my dog Buster in the 21st century. I started thinking of the future as the past, which should give you an idea of how confusing this whole situation was. Julia's boarding house was in the Chelsea area, which was still largely made up of mansions and townhouses. But there were a few old wooden houses west of the Flatiron. I got out of the Rolls and walked up the steep stairs to knock on the cheap wooden door. The door was opened for me by a Rottweiler in a dress, who was either the owner of the boarding house or its guard. I took off my hat and said as politely as I could, "I have come to see Miss Julia Richmond." She looked around my car and muttered, "Girl." I understand. She thought I was someone like Ziegfeld, but she shouted over her shoulder, "He's here." I went down to the sidewalk to wait for Julia to appear, which happened a few moments later. She looked both expectant and nervous. Julia looked gorgeous in a simple pencil skirt and white blouse with a small decorative men's tie and one of those shell-shaped hats that were popular with flappers. Her beautiful face was without evening makeup, just a little lipstick, blush, and eyeliner. She was the freshest, most beautiful sight I had ever seen. She smiled shyly and said flirtatiously, "Hello, Frank." I said, "Good afternoon, my fair lady. How about a day of talking about writing?" I planned to take her to Dante's Cafe on McDougal Street, south of Bleecker, in the village. It was a gathering place for writers of that era, and it still existed in my time. People such as Eugene O'Neill, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and even Hemingway drank their espresso and cappuccino there. So I knew that there would be the right atmosphere there. Julia looked as happy as a 5-year-old at Christmas. It was an amazing transformation. You have to understand that this was a magnificent woman, and my experience with such creatures, at least in my time, was that they were all narcissistic, selfish, narcissistic like my current wife. This woman was sincere and simple-minded, like a child. She did not understand her potential power over men. I opened the door of the Rolls and Julia looked at me with admiration. She showed off her fine leg as she sat down in the leather back seat. She said, "I didn't know you were as rich as Mr. Ziegfeld." I didn't know either. But Rolls had clearly chosen me, and now I had money, thanks to the gold bars I had hidden in my room in Algonquin. The most amazing thing about Julia was the way she called her lover Mr. and not Flo. It was as naive, perhaps even strange, as anything I had ever experienced. But it perfectly summed up the contradiction that was Miss Julia Richmond. She slept with a major celebrity and still sounded so innocent, like a farm girl from Toledo, Ohio. I asked curiously, "Why do you keep calling Ziegfeld Mister? Isn't he your boyfriend?" Julia blushed like a cherry. It was a charming quality, and said, embarrassed, "Please don't mention him. He was just using me for his pleasure. He said he would be my mentor and help me break into the writing business. But I was just one of his fleeting whims. I'm so ashamed." Well, that was great news, maybe," I said, trying not to sound too interested. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. I thought that Ziegfeld was your mentor as well as your lover, that you were a couple." She said angrily, "We were never a couple. Yes, I gave myself to him. But he was a very convincing person. He made me think that he cared about me and would protect me and take care of me." She continued sadly, "A strong, confident guy like you doesn't understand what it means to be a woman in a place like Manhattan. I couldn't sleep when I first arrived because I was so scared. Then Mr. Ziegfeld found me and made me feel protected and loved." She added shyly, "That's all I ever wanted in life. So, of course, I fell in love with him. But Billy Burke, Ziegfeld was married to her at the time. Found out about us. I thought, how could she not know? Ziegfeld showed Julia to everyone." Julia was still saying, and she insisted that he end our relationship. She began to sob. He was so cruel and indifferent, as if he really didn't care. Seriously, she believed he cared. The woman was a paradox. Looking at Julia, you would think she was a predator, hard-hearted, selfish, treacherous, and narcissistic like every woman whose life is made easier by a perfect face and body. But it wasn't Julia. The woman was a truly good person who simply assumed that the people around her were as polite, honest, unpretentious, and decent as she was. My heart went out to her. It attracted predators without any natural defenses. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to formulate words. There are people who believe the glass is half empty and those who believe the glass is half full. Julia was clearly one of the latter. I'm a realist. For me, the only correct approach is to find the right size glass. That's why it was so easy for me to leave Ashley. She didn't come. But Julia Richmond was in perfect form. Seriously. She was genuine, honest, straightforward, and uncomplicated, as well as smart and insightful. Then an inappropriate thought came. She probably thinks she's fat with these skinny, flat flappers around her. Thank God for feminine complexes. Be that as it may, Julia's beauty quickly faded into the background as you recognized the soul living in this beautiful body. If you grew up in a happy family like Julia, you assume the world is kind and loving. People around you confirm this to you, and you come to the conclusion that doing the right thing is the only way to live, and this makes you think that everyone around you feels and acts the same way as you. It's a worldview that a lucky few have. The problem is that most of these people are either part of a religious community or never leave the farm. For those of us who have to deal with the real world and all its ugliness, you quickly learn that empathy and thoughtfulness are not the norm, and it makes you grow a thick and very cynical skin. Seriously, my friends, virtue is nice and all, but the primitive earth ape from which we all descended, what the Bible calls original sin and psychology calls the ID, always has its say. Therefore, there is a constant internal debate between our tendency to violence, lies, and selfishness and our willingness to do the right thing. And this conversation is never rational. Therefore, one must consciously decide, almost force oneself to live a decent life. Julia clearly chose morality over the dark desires that lurk within all of us. And in this respect, Julia's honesty and integrity set her apart from Ashley, and, to be honest, from myself. Julia put her principles above her own interests. She has already proven it, at least to me, with her irrational loyalty to that scoundrel Ziegfeld. Julia looked at me in bewilderment. I had another one of those realization moments. I thought it would be better to start acting like a suitor rather than a carnival participant. I said cheerfully, I'm going to take you to a place where writers gather in the village. This is not a particularly remarkable place, but you can meet real authors there. We might even meet someone you know. Julia's face lit up with joy. Café Dante, which in my time was simply called Dante, is an Italian cafe. Back then, it provided espresso and cappuccino to the area's predominantly Italian immigrant population. It was also a meeting place for the era's artists and writers who abounded in 1920s Greenwich Village. But such future gangsters as Albert Anastasia, Joe Bananas, and Big Sam Acady also went there. The place was nondescript, located in the middle of a block of mostly apartment buildings on McDougal Street in the West Village. Everyone looked at us as we took a table on the sidewalk under a canopy. It was difficult to know whether it was because of the roles we arrived in or because of Julia. The Italian waiter couldn't take his eyes off her as we both ordered cafe Americano and apple pie. Everyone has probably experienced what happened next. My only goal was to be alone with the woman of my dreams. I didn't plan any further. It was obvious that Julia was even more nervous than I was. So we were essentially two strangers sitting together at a small table, not knowing how to start a conversation. The pause was awkward, to say the least. Finally, I said, "Do you want to become a writer? What have you written so far?" Julia blushed modestly, which was a charming quality in such a beautiful woman, and said, "I've written 3 complete novels and a lot of poetry. None of it has been published." I said, focusing on her face, "Tell me what they are about." She said, They are observations of growing up in an age when all old beliefs have disappeared. I was born in 1902, so she was 23, a little older than I thought, and think how much has happened since then. I mean, there were no planes, no movies, no radio, no telephones, and we weren't in a world war. More importantly, from my point of view, women got the right to vote. Wow, I've spent the last 10 years writing about the same thing. I mean, Julia perfectly summed up the anxiety caused by the incredible advances in technology and the impactful social and political movements that are impacting our society. In fact, I've written several magazine articles about how the internet is the most significant influence on human evolution since the invention of the printing press, at least in terms of its impact on society in general and our lives in particular. My beautiful companion went on to list all the changes she had experienced that were as significant as modern global connectivity, such as the ability for the first time to instantly talk to someone at a distance, or, better yet, visit them by air, and the radio networks that introduced mass information and all the social manipulation it implied. Of course, the most significant event for Julia was the 19th Amendment, which gave half the country's population the same rights as the other half. Women were second-class citizens in America until the passage of the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920, which, if you're keeping score, was exactly 132 years after the Constitution was ratified. Until then, women couldn't serve on juries or work while pregnant, let alone pursue any career they wanted. They lost citizenship if they married a foreigner, including English speakers such as Canadians. In fact, it was not until 1927 that separate toilets for women in public buildings began to be required. Compare these transformations with the strange political and social trends of our era, and you will realize that my beautiful little friend was talking about truly radical social changes. She understood the nuances of it and wrote about it, which further proved how smart and insightful she was. Julia suddenly fell silent and looked at me, horrified. It was like she had done something shocking. It took a few seconds to understand her reaction. Then it dawned on me, as strange as it may sound to 21st century ears, that well-mannered young women of that era were taught never to express their opinions, especially if they contradicted a man's. It doesn't work that easy, darling. I missed the implications of Julia's modern views because every woman in my time, at least those who weren't married to their brother, thought and acted the same way, and they weren't shy about saying it. However, in Julia's mind, instead of proving to me that she was an intelligent and insightful person, she thought that she had committed a serious social transgression. I needed to dispel this misconception immediately. I laughed and said, "You think you've crossed the line with your modern thoughts, don't you? Let me tell you, honey, you just confirmed that we are made for each other because we have the same worldview." Julia looked puzzled, then relieved. I took her hand, which was also a social violation in that era, and said, "Your insight and understanding of the human condition, both male and female, and obvious interest in the forces that shape our lives, tell me that you are not just a beautiful little girl from Toledo, Ohio. You are a real deep thinker. So forget about your obvious feminine attractiveness. I want to share your beautiful soul." Julia seemed to melt right in front of me. Unless you've been living under a rock your whole life, you know what I'm talking about. Her eyes softened, then began to moisten, and her graceful other hand instinctively reached out to grasp mine tightly. I thought a completely inappropriate thought. This woman is really strong. It must be from living on a farm. We finished our coffee, and I was trying to think of something to extend our time together when the idea of visiting Brentano's struck me. I mean, if Julia was who I thought she was, she loved books. So I left $1 on the table, which was a huge tip for the waiter, and we headed to the curb. I whistled, "This way, boy," and the rolls pulled up in front of me. Yes, he was a dog in a previous life. I decided to call him Buster. Brentano's was practically new at the time, with shelves stocked with books. Why, the place was almost as intellectually stimulating as a Kindle bookstore. This is sarcasm if you didn't understand. Julia wandered around the store, looking like a cliched child in a metaphorical candy store. I was surprised that she had never been to Brentano's. But Julia was limited by where she was taken, and it was obvious that the men she knew before she met me were not interested in her literary talents. I, on the other hand, was amazed to see Scott Fitzgerald sitting alone at a small table at the back of the large room. He published The Great Gatsby in April 1925, and the book did not sell. So he went back to town, trying to drum up interest through a book event, and no one came. Seriously, I mean this. I know Gatsby is considered the great American novel of our time, but in 1925 it was a commercial failure, so I was able to walk right up to the table where Fitzgerald was sitting and introduce myself. And yes, you can imagine how shocked I was. Fitzgerald was a literary star in the 1920s thanks to the two books. He published one in 1920, the other in 1922. These books cemented his legend as a leading author of the Jazz Age, a term he himself coined, and he was as rich and famous as any modern media icon. He had the classic Irish look, with the sleek, slicked back, center-parted hair that was very fashionable among the East Coast privileged. He was shorter than I imagined, maybe 5'7" and he had a sparkle in his eyes when he looked at women. So you can imagine how he reacted when I walked up with Julia in tow. Julia didn't recognize Fitzgerald until I told her who he was. She was shocked. Fitzgerald shook my hand firmly, as if I were his long-lost friend. I could guess his motives, but I introduced him to Julia anyway. I said, "This is my friend, Julia Richmond. She's an aspiring writer." Julia blushed like a schoolgirl and smiled beautifully as Fitzgerald took her hand and said seriously, "What did you publish?" She lowered her eyes and muttered sadly, "Nothing, really." He turned to the man standing next to the table and said, "Why don't you take a look at her work, Max?" Max was Maxwell Perkins, publisher of Scribner's magazine. Julia could not even dream of the opportunity to appear in this magazine. Perkins, who was no fool, said, "Let's set up a time, dear, and we'll talk." Julia looked like she was about to pass out. She swallowed and said hesitantly, "Any time is fine. Shall I call you?" I wasn't going to let that happen. I remembered how susceptible my beautiful little friend was to tricks Ziegfeld. So I said, "We'll set up a time. I'll call you tomorrow." No one doubted this statement since I was a man. I was about to leave when Fitzgerald said with a suspicious amount of enthusiasm, "You know, why don't you two come visit me this weekend? I'm throwing a party." At the time, Fitzgerald was living on the Riviera with his wife Zelda, but he still had a mansion on Long Island, which he bought after becoming famous with The Beautiful and Damned. Wow, I was just invited to a real jazz age party by the guy who invented the term. My problem was that the only plans I could confidently make were for the present. I had no idea how the mystical force that brought me to 1925 worked. But at the end of every other visit, I always returned to the plaza like Cinderella when the clock struck midnight. Even worse, I wasn't sure I could go back no matter how much incentive I had. There was also a problem with my beautiful but very naive friend. Julia had already proven that she was an easy target for any famous guy, and Fitzgerald looked at her as if he wanted to get to know her much better. If his party is anything like those in his novels, it will be a riot, and there will be no better place for seduction than the Great Neck Mansion that Fitzgerald used as the model for the downfall of his heroine Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby, Gatsby's mansion on the West Egg. Julia said enthusiastically, "We'd love to come. What time?" Fitzgerald said nonchalantly, "Just come whenever you want. We start drinking early." This was not an exaggeration. Fitzgerald and his wife consumed incredible amounts of alcohol, which was illegal, of course, but quite affordable. I told Julia I should check my calendar first, meaning to find out if I would still be in this era or if I would be 98 years in the future. Fitzgerald said lightheartedly, "Come if you can. You'll both be welcome." I'm sure. It was approaching evening time, and I assumed that Julia was hungry. So I called Buster, and we went to Delmonico's. It wasn't inspirational, I know, but give me a break. This was the only establishment that I knew for sure existed in 1925. Julia was not dressed enough for this place, but the head waiter took one look at her and found us a table. Of course, I paid him for it. Julia sat there in the dim light of the restaurant, her eyes shining, and said, I don't want this day to end. Almost 24 hours had passed, and I was worried that Julia's evening would end dramatically with me suddenly disappearing from her sight. I thought, it's time to act. I said, I never want this to end, period. I know it's very rushed, and I don't want to scare you away, but I fell in love with you at first sight. Our time today only confirmed this feeling. You are special to me. Julia's face went through a series of emotions, and she burst into tears. I handed her the handkerchief that all men wore then, and she sobbed into it for a moment. Then she looked up with her beautiful brown eyes and said, This makes me happier than I've ever been in my life. At this stage, I was fully prepared to remain in the 20th century. I woke up in a luxurious hotel bed. There was only one question. In the plaza or in Algonquin? I remembered falling asleep in Algonquin. Now it was morning and I was somewhere. But the main question was, where? I remembered driving Julia home. We parted under a street lamp in front of her modest guest house. It was like a scene from a romantic black and white movie. I held both her hands, looked into her deep, intelligent eyes, and said with sincerity, Tomorrow at noon I will pick you up, and we will go to Fitzgerald's party. Her eyes shone with complete satisfaction as she kissed me on the cheek and said, I'll be there with the bells. I almost shuddered at this old-fashioned phrase. I had to remind myself that this was the 1920s, when this was considered cool youth slang. I was really afraid that I would open my eyes and see Ashley sleeping next to me. So I carefully reached out to the other side of the bed and felt no one. It didn't mean anything that Ashley might have spent the night with Horseface. I told myself, stop being a coward, and opened my eyes. I've never been more excited to see gorgeous 1920s decor in my life. It became increasingly clear that the transition back to the future occurred when I had a specific reason to return to the 21st century. The first time I came back was out of fear that my key card wouldn't work. Next time I came back to make sure that Ashley really was a traitor. So maybe all I had to do to stay in 1925 was not want to leave. It would be easy, because I had the best reason, Julia. It would be nice to deal with my cheating wife once and for all. But the consequences of my sudden disappearance from her privileged life were probably the best revenge. I mean, the optics of a missing husband being cheated on by his wife would definitely hurt the congressman's chances of re-election. Why not? The cheater and her dad, and maybe Horseface, could become persons of interest. What a great idea. I arranged to pick up Julia from her boarding house at noon. I arrived 5 minutes before the appointed time. But Julia was already standing on the street, waiting for the Rolls to turn the corner of 9th Street and West 24th. It was obvious that she couldn't wait to meet. Whether it was because of me or because of the party at Fitzgerald's, I had to find out. But I was optimistic. Julia wore a white silk blouse and pleated skirt, with her long, beautiful red hair pulled back into an intricate updo that accentuated her graceful neck and the perfect symmetry of her beautiful face. She wore a blue cardigan, white low heels, and stockings to complete the look. Julia's face broke into a sunny smile as we drove up. I opened the door, and she sat down, leaving behind her a trail of perfume that evoked ancient rites performed under a dark moon. This scent, combined with her effortlessly beautiful body, remember, skinny and flat girls were in fashion back, then made me feel quite out of place. I said, "Good morning, my dear. I hope you slept well." She hugged my arm with a joyful sense of ownership and said, "I've been dreaming about you all night." Then she asked hesitantly, as if it was very important, "Do you still love me?" Women, this is probably the most ridiculous question since gender relations began. My feelings for Julia Richmond went much deeper than her beauty. She was sweet, talented, and modest, with a sharp mind comparable to Dorothy Parker. But unlike Dottie, she still believed in people. Moreover, my girlfriend was a free thinker in an era when women were taught not to contradict conventional wisdom. Julia was attentive, kind, and honest to a fault. Her flaw was that she was a people pleaser and always tried to do the right thing literally and with Ziegfeld. This means that it was difficult to convince her when she made a decision. In many ways, a woman with Julia's worldview was better suited to the 21st century than the 20th. And then it dawned on me. I ended up in 1925 because my soul, or whatever else they call my feelings, was suited to this era. And Julia was better suited to my time, but she was stuck here. So maybe I ended up in 25 because some crazy cosmic force decided that we should be together and brought me to this time. I was happy with this explanation as it gave me this wonderful life partner, and I never refused the metaphorical gift of fate. The trip to Great Neck was nothing like it would be today. First, most highways, bridges, and tunnels did not yet exist. So my trusty Rolls drove us through Lexington to the Queensboro Bridge, and then east along Northern Boulevard. We drove past Flushing Bay and the Murray Hill area of Queens. We then drove south of Little Neck Bay to the Fitzgerald Mansion on Gateway Drive in Great Neck. We drove past Willets Point in Flushing. This was the Valley of Ashes, where most of the waste in Brooklyn and Queens was burned. In 1925, the entire area was a swamp, and it was so far from the city that its desolation did not affect the people except for the few who lived there. It was a wasteland of ash and smoke, just as Fitzgerald had described. He probably passed through it often on his way into town, hence the source of the metaphor. The city cleared the area in 1939 and then held 2 World's Fairs there. The site was taken over by the Mets baseball team in 1964. The contrast between what I saw outside my window now and what I remembered from occasional trips to Shea Stadium was disorienting. In Fitzgerald's book, Gatsby's mansion was on the east coast of Great Neck, overlooking the west coast of Sands Point, where Daisy's mansion was. But Fitzgerald's real mansion, the one he used as a model for Gatsby's home, was actually located in the heart of Great Neck. It was an impressive Italianate building, set back on a curved driveway and surrounded by carefully manicured landscaping. No one greeted us upon arrival, but this was not necessary as the door to the mansion was wide open, and we could hear loud music and voices coming down the long marble hallway leading to the spacious back lawn. Julia grabbed my hand as we walked through the French doors and onto the terrace. It was obvious that she was nervous. It was touching. The woman whose beauty could command a room was in fact painfully shy. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon, but it was obvious that the party had been going on for some time. The terrace was littered with half-empty bottles of alcohol, and a large wooden His Master's Voice record player played jazz tunes. Several couples were playing croquet and badminton, all dressed in some version of white, and 3 well-dressed men and a woman were drinking at a large table with an umbrella. Fitzgerald sat with them. As soon as Fitzgerald saw us, or rather, Julia, he walked joyfully toward the terrace. His wife Zelda was having fun with French guys by the pool at their Cannes home, which he eventually turned into the plot of his latest novel, Tender is the Night. So you understand. He said, full of joy, "Great, you have arrived," and took Julia's hand with both of his. Julia blushed almost purple and said, "Thank you for the invitation. I've never seen such a beautiful place." It was obvious that Julia felt out of place, and no one else would either. The 21st century is full of media stars thanks to the internet. But at that time, there were only newspapers and a few specialized celebrity magazines, and in all of them, Fitzgerald was the nation's literary golden boy. Julia was not attracted to Fitzgerald as much as she was enchanted. She was from a town where the most important author was the woman who wrote the Nancy Drew books. So meeting the man responsible for such romantic clichés as Beyond Heaven and The Beautiful and Damned was the equivalent of meeting Danielle Steele standing on the shoulders of Nicholas Sparks in 1925. Fitzgerald said enthusiastically, "Come on, I want to introduce you to some friends." And he pulled Julia towards the table at which he was sitting. I followed them, unnoticed. It was starting to remind me of that unforgettable moment in the plaza lobby, 98 years in the future, when I, too, was overweight. Was this just 4 days ago? 2 men and a woman were sitting at the table. One guy was as tall as me, which was unusual for that time. The other was a careless little man. The woman was in the same category as Ashley, beautiful but arrogant. Neither man paid any attention to me, although both looked attentively at Julia. Fitzgerald said cheerfully, "These are my friends John and Edward's wife Elaine. Meet Frank Sullivan and Julia Richmond." Both men nodded in my direction. I was uninterested. Fitzgerald sat Julia between him and the tall guy. I took a seat next to Edward and his wife. It really reminded me of that incident in the plaza lobby. Julia looked lost. A guy named John said, sounding predatory, "So, what are you doing here, baby?" Julia, who looked like she was about to cry, muttered, "Mr. Fitzgerald invited us." The tall guy said amiably, "That's enough for me. My name is John Dos Passos, and this is my friend Ed Cammons. We're both writers, like Fitz here." My God, Dos Passos was a major literary critic and influential figure, so his homely friend had to be E. Cammons. They hung out together because they were both ambulance drivers in the First World War, which ended less than 7 years ago. This made the woman at the table Elaine Orr, whom Cammons had just married after her divorce from her first husband. The fact that Cammons was the father of the child Elaine had recently given birth to may have had something to do with the divorce. I also knew that they would be divorced within the next year. But I didn't share this information because it would look like I could see the future. Seriously, after all, I wouldn't want to seem suspicious. So Julia and I were spending a sunny summer day on Long Island with a golden boy novelist, king of literary critics, and one of the most famous poets of the 20th century. No pressure. Dos Passos turned to me and said, "What are you doing, Frank?" It didn't occur to him to ask Julia because, after all, she was a woman. I casually said, "I work in Hollywood." This was technically correct. Julia gasped and looked at me as if I had announced that I was working outside the gates of heaven. Fitzgerald looked indifferent, but of course he had his own motives, and the other two looked at me with contempt. It took a little time to understand their attitude. Both were deeply passionate about communism. Dos Passos even fought in the Spanish Civil War 11 years later, so they probably saw me as a capitalist henchman writing for the boss. Fitzgerald said, "Have we seen one of your films?" Well, I couldn't talk about my scripts in detail since talkies wouldn't be invented for another year and talking films for 2. So I just shrugged and said, "How about The Time Traveler's Wife?" This was technically correct and had the advantage of being released 90 years in the future. They all looked politely with blank looks. Fitzgerald then turned to Julia and said, "Why don't we show you around the estate while these three talk about writing? I'm sure you'll get bored with the conversation." This was ironic, given Julia's already stated interest. This also meant that Cammons' wife would not be bored, but she was expected to just sit there and smile with a blank smile on her face because she was married to Cammons. And Fitzgerald, well, he had his own motives, of course. Julia looked at me with concern as Fitzgerald took her hand and led her towards his mansion. It was obvious that the owner of the estate had something more on his mind than just a walk. Everyone at the table looked at me as if they knew what was going to happen and sympathized with me. I sat there, trying to be civil, not to make a scene. It was maybe the count of 3 before the bomb went off in my head, and I said to myself, "This is all BS. I don't need any damn conventions. I won't let Fitzgerald take advantage of the woman I love with all my heart." I told myself, "No, this won't happen, not with her," and jumped to his feet, quickly following them across the lawn. It was ironic, really. I walked away from my real wife's infidelities without a second thought, but I was willing to do whatever it took to keep this new woman pure and untouchable, even if she was just a figment of my completely confused imagination. Fitzgerald and Julia had already entered the house. I found the love of my life when I burst through the patio doors. Fitzgerald kissed her. She tried to push him away. I screamed, "What the hell?" stepped forward and pulled Fitzgerald away from Julia. I said in a steely voice, "Let me explain something to you, you bastard. I don't care what kind of literary celebrity you are. I love Julia and I'm going to marry her. And if anyone dares to touch her except me, he'll lose his hand and end up with it in his ass." Fitzgerald looked stunned. He probably really thought that I would be flattered that a literary celebrity would cuckold me. However, he was a very cold-blooded person. His whole body relaxed. He gave me a perky smile and said, "No problem, old man. I didn't know you felt that way about her. Let's have a gin and fizz and forget this happened." At this point, Julia intervened. Her voice, full of sarcasm, said, "Seriously? Do you think we'll stay here after what you just did to me? How pathetic do you think we are?" She was straightening her blouse. That's when I really saw her. Julia could be polite, attentive, even modest and shy. But she was not weak, especially if someone violated her concept of decent behavior. I probably should have known that. I mean, a woman took a bus alone, came to the most intimidating city in the USA, and lived without any support simply because she wanted to be a writer. These are the actions of a brave man. I admit that Julia fell for the trick. Ziegfeld, after all, she was a naive girl from a small town, and perhaps the failure of this relationship had thrown her a little off track. But Julia was always ready to stand by her principles, no matter what. Naturally, I thought, and not because Ziegfeld is with me now, I know. I spend too much time thinking. However, this question was answered in the next hour. Julia grabbed my hand and dragged me to the rolls, which, as always, was waiting faithfully at the entrance. Fitzgerald followed us, protesting. I looked out the window and said calmly, "No offense, old man. You just picked the wrong woman." Julia snorted loudly. She was still angry. We drove in silence. Then she turned to me, her eyes burning. She whispered firmly, "Did you really mean what you said there? Are you really going to marry me? Crap." I hoped she didn't hear it. This was really said in the heat of the moment. But to paraphrase the Latin saying, in era veritas, truth is in wrath. Seriously, I wasn't going to let this woman go. I really loved her, and I really wanted to marry her. You know, when you meet the one, you can be sure, and I was confident in my feelings to the very bottom of my soul. Consequently, I would be a complete coward if I began to waste time on trivial concerns such as my origin from another century. However, the reality was that I didn't know if Julia saw it the same way, so I said, trying to maintain my dignity in case she rejected me, "I've only known you for 4 days. During that time, I realized that you are the only person I could ever love and marry." Julia's eyes widened and her beautiful eyes darkened with emotion. I continued saying, "Our physical attraction is undeniable, and we share a rare connection in terms of interests, temperament, and beliefs. So yes, as crazy as it may sound, I would not hesitate to dedicate the rest of my days to you." Okay, I admit it, I was technically already married. But I don't think the laws about bigamy apply to the second wife if she precedes the first by 92 years. More importantly, I had no intention of returning to the 21st century, for better or for worse. I added, challengingly, "If all you want is my love and devotion, then I can promise you that." It was clear from Julia's reaction that this statement hurt her greatly. After all, she was a small-town girl with all the values that came with it. I continued, "However, I am my own person, and I respect the fact that you are too. So tell me honestly, if you think this is too hasty, I will back off. Because I am sure that we will be together for life when we get to know each other, and I want that to happen." Julia burst into tears the last time we discussed this. But this time she just sat there, looking at me, her eyes focused, as if she was trying to decide whether I was telling the truth or not. Finally, she seemed to relax and all barriers fell down. She threw herself into my arms across the seat. It didn't lead to sex in the back seat. It was something much more valuable. Julia buried her head in my shoulder and rubbed herself against it. Then she pulled away, looked at me with a cheerful sparkle in her eyes, and said, "That's it. I just marked you, like my cat does with things that she considers hers. You are mine now, and no one else can have you." It was such a sweet and touching gesture that all I could think was, this woman may have a beautiful face and figure, but she has a gentle and sincere soul. We stood frozen for several long seconds, looking at each other, faces only a foot apart. Then we kissed. I looked into her big brown eyes, with a cute wrinkle between them and a scattering of freckles on her flawless cheeks. I said, "You feel it too, don't you? This is our future together until we die." She said seriously, as if making a solemn promise, "All I ever wanted was to love and be loved. I know you are that person. You will never doubt my loyalty." Now, some of you may think that I am a complete scoundrel for making such a statement when I already had a wife. But Ashley has proven that she is not worthy of my loyalty, and more importantly, Ashley will not be born at this time, even if Julia and I live a long and happy life together. I took her tender little right hand in mine. She looked puzzled. I shook her hand as if I was making a deal and said, "I agree." Then I laughed and added, "I know how lucky I am." We drove back to town in silent unity. Julia lay across me, her face pressed to my chest, and I held her. From time to time, she raised her head and looked into my eyes, as if trying to make sure of something. Then she pressed herself against me again. If women could purr, Julia would do it. What about me? I desperately tried to find balance. That's why I was glad we didn't talk. The gap between my former comfortable life and the challenges of this brave new world would irritate anyone. So I suffered from a serious case of cultural dislocation. Social scientists call it culture shock. That is, it's one thing when romance captivates you. But I had only been a resident of the 20th century for about 4 days, and I had no idea how to live here. Think about it. Last week, I was 3,000 miles away and 100 years in the future. I may have been unhappily married and hated my job, but I had mastered all the nuances of that life. Now I was alone in someone else's time. Nothing about 1925, not his attitude, not even the sights, sounds, and smells resembled my era. I'll adapt. But this was too much. I survived until now because the basics of American society were the same, at least in general terms. This means that the basic elements of the political and social systems were similar. However, there were many nuances to everyday life in 1925 that I certainly did not know. Seriously, this was still an era when potties and latrines were all the rage and the US was largely agrarian. The emerging radio networks Sarnoff's NBC and Paley's CBS were the only media outlets, and there was no television or internet. People could drive from coast to coast on the new Route 66, but it would take a couple of difficult weeks, and if you wanted to visit Europe, it would take at least 5 days by ship. But the most difficult thing to understand was social relationships. Back then, the US was completely segregated. Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants were treated as laborers or servants. A woman's place was in the kitchen and society was absolutely fine with that. So tell me, how does someone with 21st century sensibilities make a living commenting on this without getting lynched by an angry mob of white guys? However, the real mystery was why I was so damn happy. The answer was simple. Julia wrapped me in her resilient outlook, and I was confident that I could handle it no matter what life threw at me. A good woman does this for a man. Honestly, most of my confidence was based on my financial plans. I was looking to invest in some new startups like Chrysler and a small company in Bethpage called Grumman, so I knew that I would eventually become rich. I also knew that I would be filthy rich when I sold my shares at the end of October 29. It's not insider trading if Black Tuesday is in all the history books. Therefore, money was not an issue and money protects you from many other things. I dropped Julia off at her guest house after a romantic dinner under the stars in the garden room at Lu Chow's. I know that sounds pretty anticlimactic considering what just happened between us. But it was 1925, and I was observing an important social convention. When we said goodbye, I gave Julia a kiss. She clearly appreciated it. I mean, I was pretty sure she would have come back to me if I had asked. But in 1925, a good girl wouldn't allow herself to be intimate with a guy on the first date, no matter how much he liked her. All social basics had to be respected, and at a minimum, there had to be courtship. We both knew it. I hear the question, but she slept with Ziegfeld on the first date. Yes, indeed, Ziegfeld took advantage of Julia's vulnerability, but for him she was just a conquest. nothing more. I wanted Julia for a long time. Therefore, she had to understand that for me, she is much more than a trophy. The sex will come later, and it will be better because her heart will be in it. Julia was clearly very sexy. It was felt in her every movement, and she could give you such a longing look that your socks would set on fire. But she considered herself a good girl, and this perception was important to her. Accordingly, she kept her passionate nature under lock and key like any person with an ounce of self-respect. Julia had sex for the first time with the man she was planning to marry, but the Spanish flu took him a week before the wedding. Julia told me that he was cheerful and healthy on Monday, and by Friday he was already dead. The first influenza pandemic was extremely virulent and sudden. History tends to forget unique events like the Spanish flu because they are so fleeting and personal. But in 1 year, he killed 10 times more Americans than all our soldiers died in the entire First World War. And yes, it was the H1N1 strain, the one we are so familiar with today. The death of her fiancé crushed Julia, and this became the reason for her moving to New York. She sadly told me, "Life is fleeting, so you need to live here and now and not wait for an uncertain future." 1 week I was supposed to become a farmer's wife, and a week later I had no future. There was nothing left at home, so I left for another place to find yourself again. It was a sensible look, so typical of Julia. We're all drifting, and none of us, even the most enlightened, sees all the stones. Therefore, you need to be prepared to overcome life's obstacles when they arise. Julia had the courage, strength, and adaptability to do it. I saw Julia every day after that. Every day was a new experience with the most interesting best friend in the world. I would pick her up, and we would do cultural things like evenings at the Philharmonic or walks through the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The reality that my wife Ashley left me in this very place just 10 days ago was simply 99 years removed from my mind. Julia did it this way. However, Julia was not only sophisticated, she was also a baseball fan, so we went to East 161st in the Bronx and watched Ruth, Jerry, Lazary, and the rest of the legendary Killer Line players play baseball. And my modest and shy woman turned into a beer drinker whose loud opinion about the referees was openly slanderous. And yes, I was aware of how special it was. Julia's remarkable beauty attracted attention wherever we went. She was even noticed by Ziegfeld the night we visited his last follies. During intermission, he came up smiling, ignoring me, and put his hand on Julia. I don't know what Ziegfeld expected, but he received an icy voice that said, "Get your paws off me, or I'll report it to the police." Finally, we consummated our love affair in Atlantic City. This place was the Vegas of the 1920s, a place where people went to shed their inhibitions and relax. Monopoly had not yet been invented, but Atlantic City was the place the game is based on. There was an embankment, yes, that very embankment, and 400 other tourist attractions. The trip from Penn Station took 3 hours. We checked into Traymore on a beautiful summer day. The Traymore was an impressive piece of architecture, well worth its high price tag. In the 21st century, I thought of Atlantic City as a sad, run-down place. But almost 100 years ago, the huge marble lobby of this huge hotel was better than anything I had seen in New York. The view of the Atlantic from our room across the promenade and sandy beach was magnificent. As soon as we entered the room, Julia began to unpack the modest contents of her cheap suitcase. What kind of habit do women have of settling down? Then it dawned on me that this was the exact same scene I had experienced 2 months ago with Ashley. The contrast between my wife and my new love could not be more stark. Julia, with a sly smile, disappeared into the bathroom, which was a novelty for hotels at that time. She returned wearing an old, worn robe. I was about to ask what was going on when she motioned for me to shut up and stood in front of me, her brown eyes blazing with fire. I was puzzled. Then Julia kissed me. She looked at me with an intense gaze. This meant that she had made up her mind. And I hate to tell you guys, but it's always the woman who decides. We made love. Julia said, "I think it shocked you. This certainly amazed me. I've never been. You must understand that this is a gift that I am giving you." She then casually added, "So I guess that puts us on the path to marriage, if you want me." "Want her? Seriously?" I said dryly. "Well then, get me to church on time. Tomorrow." The wedding did not take place immediately or even after a couple of months. But the next day, Julia moved into my room at the Algonquin. Dottie gave me approving glances every time we crossed paths, and she ensured Julia a permanent place among the invitees at the round table. Dottie had a kind soul behind her intimidating intellect, and I think she saw how much Julia and I loved each other. Julia was as delighted by the witty conversations of the round table members as I was, and Julia could hold her own in front of anyone. Of course, it was not a laurel on which a beautiful woman like Julia could rest. Julia told me that the round table was the community she dreamed of joining when she came to New York. Our participation increased our visibility, and since the round table was the pinnacle of literary society, we received requests for articles. The jobs that people like Perkins and Ross offered us allowed us to live off the income from our writing, which was a surprising but very welcome bonus. We didn't need the money I brought from the 21st century. Of course, my investments were going well, just as I knew they would. It's useful to see the future. But it was nice when your calling, like writing, was recognized by someone other than your spouse. The fact that Julia published more articles than me made me happy, because Julia needed this recognition more than I did. We finally got married in Toledo. At the time, it was Ohio's third largest city, with a population of about 250,000. Both of Julia's parents were present. Mine couldn't come because they weren't born yet, so I told everyone that I was an orphan. Julia's father was a manager at the Libby glass plant, not a farmer. Therefore, the wedding was a kind of social event. Julia's status as a society princess was another thing she didn't mention. I thought she was a country girl, but the farmer probably wouldn't fund his daughter's writing career, so I had to figure it out. I met Julia's ex-fiance's parents at a wedding. They were a German couple who actually owned a farm on Star Road, west of Toledo. The groom's mother constantly thanked Julia in broken English. The woman had tears running down her cheeks as she did this. I think it was because Julia's gesture gave them some comfort after the loss of their son. My wife's big heart had such an effect on people. I thought the invitation from her ex-fiance's parents was a touching and humane gesture made out of simple kindness, not disrespect. The contrast between Julia's concern for the feelings of a couple of broken old men and Ashley's antics of inviting jerk to her philandering sister's wedding couldn't be more obvious. After that, we took the 20th Century Limited back to Grand Central Station. Given my 21st century biases, one of the things that surprised me most about the 1920s was the ease with which one could move around the country. The advent of the airline industry and the superhighways that Ike built killed the railroads, but in 1925 trains were a truly cheap and comfortable way to get from one place to another. We couldn't live in Algonquin forever, and Jersey City's picturesque, leafy neighborhoods offered a tranquil refuge from the frantic energy of Manhattan right across the river. So I took some gold from my stash and bought a house on the street near Van Vorst Park, within walking distance of the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad station. This was where I could catch the train into the city. My participation in the round table and my acquaintance with Dorothy Parker gave me enough confidence that Max Perkins of Scribner's took my novel. If you remember, I first met Max when we met Fitzgerald, and you might think that subsequent events in Great Neck might have influenced his perception. But it turned out that he disapproved of Fitzgerald's lifestyle just as much as I did. So we became allies in the fight to keep Fitzgerald on the straight and narrow. If you've ever had a book published, you know that after the first draft comes a ton of proofreading and editing. So I had the inevitable process of going back and forth to the city, working with the faceless people who make the book a reality. The process was much slower than in 2020, and my use of the past tense to describe a time that was actually 90 years in the future was a sign of my confused perception of time. After submitting the initial draft, every proof of every chapter came back to me looking like it was bleeding. Back then, Everything was typewritten with handwritten proof notes in the margins, so you couldn't just make the necessary corrections to the manuscript by pressing the backspace key like you would on a word processor. If there were changes, then each page had to be completely retyped. Julia amazed me by typing at incredible speed, so she was the one who created the next proof for me. She said proudly, "I studied secretarial science at Wait because I knew I would need those skills to become a writer." That should have told you what a motivated woman she was. Julia had already published an article in Scribner's magazine, which was well received, and she was working on an article for The New Yorker. This was the beginning of a bright career. So there I was, living a happy and comfortable life with a beautiful and smart woman, finally doing what I had wanted my whole life. But of course, as everyone knows, when your cup is overflowing, watch out. It seems that the biggest shocks always happened to me at night. Everything went fine for more than a year, and I became accustomed to life in the 20th century. It was already 1927, and I was enjoying my existence. My investment portfolio quintupled, and my sex life was like my wildest dreams. My novel was on the verge of publication. God was in his place, and all was right with the world. I went to bed at a decent hour and was looking forward to the usual good night's sleep. Then the Bee Gees' "Stayin' Alive" started playing in my head. It was like a nightmare. It was followed by Billie Jean, "Bad Romance," and then something by Taylor Swift. I don't know which song because all her songs sound the same to me. My eyes flew open. It was late at night, and I was lying on a familiar park bench. The psychological shock and actual physical pain of the horrifying realization washed over me like a herd of rabid rhinoceroses, and I lost consciousness again. The policeman woke me up at dawn, poking me with his baton. He shouted, "Come on, freak! You can't sleep here." I looked at him with the confused and clouded gaze of a disaster victim and asked anxiously, "What date is today?" This convinced the policeman that I was crazy. So he said, "If you don't move, I'll take you to the 19th precinct, and you can sleep it off in the drunk cell." I said pleadingly, "Please tell me, what date is today?" The policeman looked at me with contempt. He clearly thought I was on something and said, "July 31st. I said, "What year?" Now he really thought I was drunk. He said, "2024. When did you think this was it?" I would have ended up in a mental hospital in Bellevue if I had told him 1927. Instead, I silently collapsed onto the bench, exhausted. The 21st century brought me back, and I didn't know why. In fact, I didn't even think seriously about coming back because I thought I could decide for myself whether to stay. Stupid man. Such monumental arrogance was frankly Sophoclean in his arrogance and stupidity. I spent the night in a temporary cell in the 19th precinct on East 67th Street. In the morning, I was given a summons and released into the street barefoot in the silk pajamas in which I slept that night in 1927. My outfit would have stood out in any other city, but passers-by in New York didn't even blink. It was a strange feeling to live 2 full years in another time and come back the day after I left it. But based on the date, Ashley and I started a row about her immoral behavior just yesterday morning. Therefore, this entire circus was still in the plaza. Even more ironic, if Ashley was still flirting with Horseface, I probably wasn't even missed. The plaza was a few steps down 67th Street and 5th Avenue. The receptionist didn't blink an eye when I stood there in my pajamas and asked for a duplicate key. Luxury hotels see a lot of strange guests. Ashley wasn't in the room. Of course she wasn't. My soon-to-be ex-wife now had other priorities. Ashley not being there was a huge relief as I was in a hurry and didn't want to deal with her. Besides, she was dead to me. I showered, shaved, and changed into something comfortable. Then I went to the Chase Bank on Madison Avenue. I had my passport in my travel bags, so I had the ID I needed to receive the money. I reviewed all the logical actions while sitting in the cell and came to the final decision. In reality, there was only one viable option. But first I needed to do a little scouting. Specifically, I needed to find out what happened to Julia after I so unceremoniously disappeared from her life. Luckily, we have this thing called the internet, and you can learn a lot from the free computer at the New York Public Library. Thanks to genealogy enthusiasts, obituaries in the United States are available and well documented online. So it was just a matter of finding the right Julia Richmond. I searched among the names of a surprisingly long list of women from that time and found nothing. Then it dawned on me, and I tried Julia Sullivan, her married name. This also gave a long list. It seemed that I would be kicked out of the library before I found anything. Then a thought came to me. I entered Julia Richmond Sullivan 1902 and got a single obituary from the Toledo Blade. It was buried at Toledo Memorial Park in Sylvania, Ohio. Amazingly, it was dated September 6, 1927. The photograph of Julia was exactly as I remembered it, but the obituary headline tore my heart apart. It read, "Died of love." The article said that Julia died just a month after my mysterious disappearance. It was assumed that the cause of her death was my disappearance. I could imagine the poor faithful girl, having lost her fiancé and now her husband, dying from the loss. The burden of guilt was so overwhelming that I laid my head on the keyboard and sobbed. The death of such a beautiful and intelligent woman in the prime of her life was indescribably painful. But knowing that I was the cause of this was absolutely unbearable. There is no return from such awareness. I was the walking dead. I leaned back in my chair, rubbed the tears from my eyes, and said loudly so that people around me would shush me, "This has to end here." In fact, I had already solved the problem while sitting surrounded by various Central Park alcoholics in the 19th precinct. What I learned gave me the strength to follow through without hesitation. I was apparently two identical entities fixed in time. Why? I don't know. I just knew that it was so, and for reasons unfathomable, sometimes they switched places. Consequently, the transitions back and forth from century to century would continue as long as we were both alive. So it was obvious that I needed to eliminate my 21st century version so that the other version would remain in the 20th century. Yes, I was talking about death. It made sense. Because if a person born and raised in the 21st century does not exist, then there will be nothing to pull the person from the 20th century back, and this, in turn, would save Julia from the sad fate that brought her a month later. In those days, they never said directly that someone had committed suicide. Of course, if my assumption is wrong, then I can destroy myself forever in both places. But maybe that's not such a bad thing since I couldn't imagine life without my wife. This may sound terribly sentimental and cheesy, but Julia was such an integral part of me that I ultimately saw no point in continuing this farce of life without her. So there was one last thing left to do. The evening was cloudy and damp when I walked out onto the wide steps of the library. I looked around for a taxi, and there was my trusty Rolls waiting patiently at the curb. This confirmed everything. It was the right decision. Crowds were gathering, which was understandable because it's not often you see a perfectly preserved 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost idling in Manhattan. I gave the faceless driver instructions, and we were off, heading towards the Holland and New Jersey Tunnel. Because I considered my final farewell to the 21st century a historical event, at least for me. I wanted to take my departure to a place with historical significance. It would also be nice if it was nice and secluded, so that no one interferes. I had a place in mind. It was under the Hudson Bluffs where the fatal duel took place between Alexander Hamilton, you know, that guy on the $10 bill, and the man who was Vice President of the United States at the time, Aaron Burr. You think that the current policy is irreconcilable. I stopped at True Value to buy a garden hose and duct tape. Now all that was left was to wait. It was sunset when we pulled up to a secluded spot in a condominium below the Weehawken dueling grounds. No one noticed the old Rolls with the engine running. I remembered all the happy moments spent with Julia, watching the ships move on the Hudson. I woke up with a sudden fright. The city still glowed before me, but the light was different. The skyscrapers in Midtown have completely changed, and the Intrepid that had just been moored across the river has disappeared. In fact, it won't be launched for another 16 years. I didn't know what date it was, but the time on my Rolex said 6 in the morning. I bought the Times newspaper from a boy selling early issues in front of the station. I held it in trembling hands, looking for the date July 31st, 1927. I returned the same night I left. It was obvious that the time compression was occurring while I was in another century. After all, only a day and a half has passed in the 21st century during the entire time that I was in the 20th century. I carefully entered our house through the back door. If I set this up right, Julia would never notice that I was gone back to the future or experience the heartache that would follow. I slid into bed next to her naked. I usually slept in pajamas just like the ones I wore during my little encounter with the New York criminal justice system. But I lost those pajamas at the plaza, and my 21st century clothes were just too weird. Julia stirred, opened her eyes, and looked at me with a loving gaze. It was not all in vain. Every last painful, frightening moment. I flirtingly said, "Good morning, sleepyhead." Julia covered her mouth and said hurriedly, "Give me a second to brush my teeth." Then she rushed to the bathroom. She returned a few minutes later, wearing nothing but a loving smile. Julia had no idea about the emotional storm I was going through. I almost lost her. She didn't know this, but I knew, and I needed to reaffirm our connection, reestablish the psychic connection that I had with her in a very physical way. We made love. There was a moment of hesitation. Then she raised her head and said, "What was that? And can I count on this every morning?" I didn't want to tell the incredible story of a man from another century who fell in love with a beautiful princess and who then had to die to ensure their long and happy life together. This would have gone too far for Julia's imagination. Instead, I said, "I am a man of my word. Therefore, I must be able to convey my feelings for you. But unfortunately, I cannot express how much I love you in any other way. I hope you can live with this." Julia's beautiful face showed the most intense expression of love as she said, "Always and forever." And I knew down to my toes that this was exactly what would happen. We both had to die alone to be able to die in each other's arms. Now nothing can separate us. It was pure luck that Billy Wentworth got into the stock market. He was operating a fishing boat out of Greenport on the northern tip of Long Island when he discovered 24 cases of premium whiskey floating in Gardner Sound. The Sag Harbor area has been a hot spot for alcohol smuggling from offshore ships, so it wasn't surprising the previous owners probably had a falling out with someone bigger. Unlike most of his peers, who would have simply drunk it all, Billy invested the small fortune he made from selling his finds into the stock market and became filthy rich by playing on the margin. By 1927, Billy had accumulated a fortune that would be passed down from generation to generation, so that the name Wentworth would rank with Morgan, Chase, and Mellon. Then one fateful day, the tickers at Wentworth's company filled with information about the massive sale of all his assets. Stock prices plummeted as huge blocks of shares were dumped, and the sell-off continued throughout the day. The fall in stock price eventually triggered margin calls, and since Billy was highly leveraged, he was unable to cover them. The forced sale of his assets to bring him back to minimum value liquidated much of his portfolio. That's when the mysterious entity who caused the depreciation came into play and bought Billy's assets at bargain prices. Consequently, generations of Wentworths never saw the wealth that Billy once amassed. They will probably remain fishermen, just like him. Well, easy come, easy go, and Billy never trusted his luck. The sinister man who invested in the collapse of Billy's asset value became much richer in the process of liquidation. But what pleased him most was the knowledge that he had engineered the downfall of the Wentworth family. Sometimes you have to wait a little to get what you're owed. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.